Welcome back to Pop Politics. I'm Damien Lewarden.
I'm Michael Crichton.
I'm Mitchell Ackhurst.
Together we're Third Take, and this time we're going to be talking about Australia Day and national identity and a few other things. Before we get into Australia Day specifically, I wanted to start with you, Mike. And I will ask the same question, a little bit tweaked of you, Mitchell, as well. But I want to start, when you think of your personal identity, Mike, and please note, this is another one of those loaded questions that you love so much. But do you think of yourself as an American? Is that a part of your personal identity?
I'd say when I was younger, absolutely, and now, no, not at all. Um, and I think that's for a number of reasons. Primarily, in just the most blunt way possible, I think America kind of sucks. Um, but also, as I've gotten older, I work with a lot of people all over the world, including you guys. So, yeah, I don't. When I think of myself, I don't think of myself as an American, maybe even in the first 10 descriptors.
Yeah. Mitchell, what about you for Australian?
I I'll admit I'm similar to Mike in that it will take you a good handful of descriptions before I think of myself as Australian, but maybe a couple less because I not to put it so combatively, but I really don't hate Australia in that way. Like I think it's easy to hate your home country in that sort of uh, loving sort of a way. And I
Yeah.
feel like I feel like I'm almost the reverse in that I actually love Australia because of the people it's filled with. I think that I think that our politicians are terrible, but I also kind of I love Australia in that hostile, like, oh, I don't know about you, Australia, you know you're better than this, you know, kind of a way. In that, like, well, for one thing, Australia, the country, the modern nation state, I don't think is necessary at all for me to love the people who are in the borders of the country. And so I like the people. I like the land that we have. I like I like Australia, the place, and I love Australians, but I think I hate everything above that. All the artificial structures that have been built here, and not literally the buildings. I mean, I'm not shaking my fist at buildings, but I think there's a lot of pointless nonsense at the top, which I probably shouldn't get started on that right away. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons why I think we should change.
Yeah. And the reason that I wanted to start with that question is because I've sort of had the opposite reaction to you, Mike, in that when I was younger, I didn't really regard myself, or I didn't think of myself as Australian necessarily. I guess I never really thought about it that much beyond the whole because Australia is a very sort of parochial country, I think. We're such a small country, but we have like I think it's like the eighth largest GDP in the world, and it's like we're in that sort of combative space where it's a little bit like little dog syndrome, where sort of we want to sort of I don't know make out like we're bigger than we are, or I don't know. But yeah, so I never really thought about it when I was younger, but then it was sort of when I was overseas, because I went and lived over in the UK for a year and a half, you guys know. And I guess it was sort of over there that I sort of really developed more and more the sense of, I actually like being from Australia because in a lot of ways, even though our politicians at the moment are kind of shit house, um, in a lot of ways, this country is still a hell of a lot better than the UK in terms of the support that it has for its people, and that whole space. So yeah, I do regard myself as an Australian, and that's where I wanted to start for this conversation because we're leading with Australia Day. Um, and so, Mike, before we get into that, I want to ask, what do you know about Australia Day?
Absolutely nothing. I saw you sort of prepped us that this was going to be the topic, and I was like, I'm not sure if I should look up anything. I kind of want to go in with a fresh mind because I really don't know anything. So please educate me.
That's fine. All right, so it's comparable to two US holidays, really. The first one is, I think, most obviously Independence Day because it does go to the myth of modern Australia and the founding of modern Australia. But I think the real, more comparable holiday is actually Columbus Day, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, the day that celebrates Columbus discovering the Americas. Is that right?
Yes, you're right.
So, and so that's kind of like, so yeah, it celebrates the landing of Captain Cook at Botany Bay on January 26, 1770.
6.
Yes, because the second fleet was later. Yeah, and it's Cook. Um, yeah, you can tell how much I know about my own history. Um, but I feel like, and I don't know if it's the same for you, Mitchell, but I feel like when I was a kid, and even up into the last like 10 years or so, Australia Day was never really a thing other than being that really weird holiday that interrupted the first week of school.
Hmm.
Was that sort of your impression, or did you have more of an idea of Australia Day as sort of like a national holiday?
Slightly, but I I think as much as I love the place, I'm a little bit closer to you in the sense that I never really had an Australian identity beyond some of the mythology when I was a kid. And so, the most I could tell you about Australia from when I was a kid was that, like, there was a certain point where people who look a lot more like me invaded a country filled with people who don't and who are now disadvantaged because of a whole lot of colonial sugar. I was sort of aware of that vaguely, and then the rest of Australia was just the myth. The rest of Australia for me, including Australia Day, was very much magic pudding, um, you know, bootstraps, koalas, waving flags. It must be interesting listening to this, but like it's Australiana, like there's Americana, there's this sort of chintzy side of this myth making of this country, and I guess I found myself drawn to the the more folk narratives, you know, Gold Rush and the various towns that were established, that sort of thing. But Australia Day itself always seemed like this extra step beyond that, where it's I think because of the flag waving, I think there's a certain kind of person you learn of when you're a kid, and you see like there's a certain sort of person to whom flag waving is very important, and Australia Day felt like it was that. It was a day for those people, and for me, it just meant barbecues. It meant that there was going to be barbecued meat involved.
Yeah. So would I be wrong in assuming that your personal relationship with Australia Day sort of is conflicted to some degree?
Yeah, this is I think what I meant about putting my foot in my mouth the other day. I I think Australia is a great term for the place we're in, but realistically, it's as helpful as the term Europe if you're in the UK or France or
Mm.
something, and so it's always been funny because like we don't celebrate Federation on Australia Day because Australia Day isn't Federation Day. And Federation is when the country of Australia started. So it's very odd and political and annoying that the day we celebrate the start of Australia isn't even the day when the nation state Australia started. But instead, it's this celebration of this particular colonial adventure that resulted in the really rotten, systems that have then come down for the next couple hundred years. And I have to imagine that that's actually not too unusual in former British colonies.
Mm. I mean, look at America. They kind of you kind of like lost your shit with Britain and decided to go and overthrow that whole system. But yeah, I wanted to ask that question, and I will come back to it for my response and a bit more. But Mike, I wanted to throw it over to you and ask if you have a similar sort of relationship with America's national holidays.
Yeah, Columbus Day. I think I don't know if this is just because of the internet, the existence of the internet, or what. But Columbus Day, when I was a kid, was very much something to be celebrated. It was, if I remember right, a day observed where we got off school, and Christopher Columbus was seen sort of like a hero. Um, and as I've gotten older, all of my peers, we're in agreement, regardless of political beliefs or anything like that. That dude sucked. So I don't. Yeah, I don't. I definitely cared more about Columbus Day when I was a kid, but now it is very literally just like any other day for me. Um, I do appreciate Independence Day to a degree, and I said earlier I don't want to make it sound like I hate America or anything. I'm just disappointed in America pretty regularly.
Yeah.
So Independence Day, I guess for me, I get to reflect back on the good parts of America, and I do appreciate that holiday more than something like Columbus Day, which is the day to celebrate horrible things. So yeah,
I also want to add,
Because
when you said 1770, we were thinking of a different date, and the date of the first fleet was actually 1788. So because there are a bunch of
that's
different
right.
things happening around those times, including Captain Cook's voyage, which started in 76, and a bunch of other things.
Mm. Yeah. Sorry, I got confused because yeah. Anyway, yeah, but I wanted to pick up on something that both of you have said in terms of that celebration of colonialism and like the fact that these discoverers, these founders, these founding myths of our nations, they're extremely problematic
That's an
because of
understatement.
the yeah, and because of the like even now, like people in Australia, we don't really think of the frontier wars as being a thing, but they
Mm,
were, and thousands of Indigenous people were killed in those wars. But it feels like Australia Day has become more significant in this country over the last decade or so. And that's not because it's necessarily more important to us as a nation, but I feel as if it's to some degree a reaction to the Survival Day and Invasion Day narratives that have come up in response to that colonial history,
mm,
um, because the indigenous populations have sort of responded to this founding myth and gone, well, no, that's not our Australia, and we think that we should tell the story differently. But then there's a reaction to that reaction that, oh no, rah rah, wave a flag. Australia's great and it should never change. Shut up and just celebrate it the way we want to celebrate it.
So, I mean, this is something that maybe you're more familiar with in political terms, Mike. But the flag waving, it feels like it's very similar to a lot of the stuff that's been going on with the Republicans and just the right wing in general in America. In that, if you react to the colonial narrative with facts, hey, this whole narrative you've spun about the birth of the nation is actually kind of wrong and harmful and doesn't acknowledge that we're right here and we'd like to, not be considered second-class citizens just because we were here much longer than the British. That reaction, because it's based in fact, and it's like, oh, let's just turn our eye to the history here and try and reconcile ourselves with the actual events. The flag-waving reaction to the reaction has to be overly emotional. And that's where you get people celebrating Stronger Australia Day. They're like, well, I can't react the same way to the reaction as the initial reaction because I don't have facts on my side. So instead I have to appeal to the myth and be like, well, okay, but all the stuff you're talking about, that's in the past. I'm talking about the real story of Australia, the little battlers and the snags and the lamingtons and all the stuff that makes Australia great today. The story that we tell ourselves that has a basis in feelings about cute little things rather than any real knowledge of the wider history.
Yeah, because I think that's sort of similar to what has been happening in the US, especially over the past couple of years. So, Mike, did you want to pick up with a response to that?
Not necessarily, but I do agree. I resonate with what you're saying. I didn't realize that was something happening over in Australia too, though. This sort of flag waving as a response that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's widespread. Anywhere you start a group of people, that's gonna become important to somebody, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
And at the same time, like in Australia, there has been a push to change the date of Australia Day to move it away from January 26th to sort of divorce it from that colonial connection. So I know that you won't have anything to say on this, Mike, because as you said, you don't
Okay.
know the first thing. But Mitchell, where do you sit with that? Because for me, I used to believe in the idea of changing the date, but as time's
Mm-hmm.
gone on, I think that as important as symbolism is, there's a point where it's literally just symbolism for the sake of symbolism, and that's not going
Yep.
to do anyone any good. So my thought now is sort of more, let's actually change the date rather than because like my local council, for example, they're putting on an Australia Day event where they're having a flag raising ceremony and a flyover with jets, and I'm like, what the hell? But okay, let's go with that. But then they're also hosting a survival day event, and they're two separate things. And it's really weird to me. It's like, why not actually change the day and connect the two and be like, yeah, well, let's actually use this opportunity to rah rah wave for some flags to also raise some flags about why waving the flags is problematic. Your thoughts?
I I love what you've just said. I think, there are plenty of, good middle ground solutions that would be steps towards a more harmonious celebration of the country. But I gotta be the the annoying wonk and say that if you're going to change Australia Day at all, then it's ultimately you don't want it to be Australia Day. I mean, like it's just a matter of like we're a country over a bunch of other groups of national identities that have no interest in being celebrated by Australia Day. And it's the same with countries in the EU. I'm not going to even bring Brexit into this because that's a whole other thing. But like, you wouldn't want to celebrate only Europe Day if you were in France or Germany or Italy, because like, what's that going to do for you? I mean, sure, maybe it'd be a fun celebration. It depends on your point of view. Maybe you'd enjoy having the extra day off. I know I enjoy having the public holidays, either way. But that's not the problem here. The overarching issue of like decolonization and avoiding the pitfalls of thinking about these things in a binary way, like, oh, it's us and them, or it's this and that. It's one way of governing and a different way of governing. It all just means that whichever way you slice it, Australia Day has to turn into something that is not Australia Day. It's a great start to move it off the day of the first fleet arriving. That's it's a great start to not keep reminding people of the terrible things that happened, to put it on a different date. But then you don't call it Australia Day. You have to change it to something else, and that is not a moderate solution, because again, like, people have people have had families in this country for generations. They have national identity. They have this flag waving attitude, and like, you will end up with January 6th level riots if you decide to take the radical approach and step towards decolonization and don't call it Australia Day and don't celebrate a kind of a nation that is not accepted by everyone who lives within it.
And I think that's an interesting thing you just said there, in terms of like that sense of, I guess, not belonging or not being accepted, because as you said, it's that sort of that angry response to not feeling as if your views are being reflected in the mainstream that I think at least was a part of what led to January 6 over in the US last year. So I want to come back to you, Mike, and pick up with that. Is like, I know that, like, from my understanding, the US, it's certainly not a monoculture, because at work, one of my colleagues is from Louisiana, and I mean, like, she tells stories of how like, they have their own sort of like mini culture, and a lot of what she says is just like, I'm sorry, you do fucking what? Like, deep frying turkeys? Like, is that a thing? Like, what? So, like, even little things like that is what I'm talking about when I say culture within the wider monoculture. But I'm talking about, I guess, like, those sort of like those micro cultures as well, because, like, I don't think we have that to anything like the same degree here in Australia.
No, I mean, we've got jokes, banana benders, that sort of thing, when it comes to different states. But even that is hard to mark, because the biggest distinction isn't even states. It's, do you live on the East Coast or the West Coast? And just the fact that people bring that up even is an indication that like we don't think about the fact that there's South Australia, which is neither.
And did you, so, and I want to pick up one, like, I want to change topic completely and pick up on something that you mentioned the other day, Mitchell. But before we do that, do either of you have anything that you want to say to sort of cap off this conversation for now? Like, we could have probably structured it better, but, you know, that happens when you're going free form.
Okay, well, the thing is, Australia isn't very large. I mean, we've talked about this, but like, as a country as a population, and as you indicate with like the culture, we're much more analogous to a big state of the United States. You know, our GDP is pretty high, but you know, so is California's. So I think like we're much more analogous to a state of America than we are to an entire federation of states, even though we are a federation.
We have our own.
And I think, given that scale, given the fact that we are not this United States scale country, there's a lot of problems that we deal with that we shouldn't really have any excuse to deal with. You know, like the country's enormous. We have plenty of space, and yet there are people with housing issues. You know, that's just one example. But yeah, Australia deals with a lot of issues that it's kind of hard to excuse. And relations with the First Nations people of Australia is a big one. One that I'm not qualified to discuss.
No.
But I like the idea that there's little things here and there you can do to, I don't know, make things less painful. And so, like I said, in terms of the moderate solution, moving Australia Day to begin with would be nice, because the pain it would cause is irritating some of the flag wavers, and that's way smaller than this sort of grim reminder every 12 months of when a certain group of people invaded the country.
Right. I'm going to say that this is going to be the first part of this conversation. I'm sure we'll come back to it over time. But for now, let's retreat to a little bit more safer ground, I think, because Mitchell, the runtime for The Batman was announced just the other day. And a lot of people sort of sighed and went, 2 hours and 47 minutes. Please God, no. And you were just like, you haven't seen it yet, you know.
Well,
give it a chance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you guys think, based on the fact that we were talking about the Dying Light 2 non-troversy, when they announced how long it would take to complete the entire experience was 500 hours. You know, I just think like it would be interesting to contrast that with the response to the Batman, because for one thing, there's an absolute angle. One's 3 hours or thereabouts, and one's 500 hours. You know, like absolutely, you should have like a very different thought in your mind about something that takes you 500 hours to experience versus something that takes you 3 hours. And I'm not saying that that's some sort of moral problem. I'm just saying like time is a resource like everything else, and if your first blush of however many hours it takes to experience a narrative is that it's, you know, horrible to be anywhere under, say, 20 hours, like the average length of reading a book, you know, 10 to 20 hours, depending on what sort of books you like reading, you know. If something like that can be the case, I think anything less than that you're complaining about is kind of pointless. It's like, whatever, you haven't seen the movie. If it's 3 hours long and you loved it, it's just like any other TV show that's got multiple episodes. Sure, there might be an accessibility issue in terms of having to sit in the theater for 3 hours and whether you can actually do that or not. But that's like the majority of people who see this movie over the course of the time that it is available to see will be watching it at home, when you can pause it.
Mm.
So ultimately, I don't think it's a huge deal. But I thought it'd be interesting to bring up because maybe you guys have different thoughts or maybe contrasting thoughts about how it relates to the Dying Light discussion and talking about things being extra long and maybe even this one last part, does it being long mean it's more for adults? Because that's one of these other things that popped up too. It's like, it's a long movie, therefore it's more serious because it's telling a grander story or something. You know, kids couldn't sit through 2 hours and 47 minutes of Batman. It's too big.
That's a really odd point because Spider-Man No Way Home was like 2.5 hours, and an extra
Precisely.
17 minutes isn't that much.
Yep.
I think, like me, I don't mind long movies. I do find, like, to some degree, I do find them hard to sit through. Just because, like, I don't know, I'm twitchy. I like to get up and move around, and I don't like to just sit in one place for too long. Um, but I think the bigger issue for me is that it is a long superhero movie. Um, I'm not a fan. I've tried a bunch. Every time I do, I just walk away disappointed and just thinking, why do people like this so much? Why do people find it life-changing or whatever? I don't understand it. Um, but like something like Silence, yeah, sure, I'll sit down and watch 3 hours of Silence. Something like Titanic, sure, I'll sit down and watch 3 hours of Titanic. Something like The Batman, uh, yeah, I probably won't.
Well,
Mike, what about you?
yeah.
Um, I mean, I think I find it funny that people would get upset over the runtime of a Batman movie. I generally trust Matt Reeves, and if he says the Batman needs to be 2 hours and 40 whatever minutes, I trust him with that. I'm happy with a long movie as long as the pacing is good. As long as the pacing holds up,
Mm.
and it kind of guides me through it, that's fine with me. Yeah, I just don't understand why people get upset over movies being long. It just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, if we go in and see the movie and the pacing's not great and it's a bit of a drag, then yeah, you're really going to feel that runtime. It just depends on what they do with it, and it's just so hard to even judge that before we've seen it. So
Mm.
maybe after we see the movie, we can talk about how that runtime may or may not have been a good idea. But for now, it's just Matt Reeves thinks this Batman movie needs to be 3 hours. I'm excited to see why he thinks it needs to be 3 hours.
That's a good point. Because it's like, it is really the directorial vision, and it's worth interrogating that, like the why of that. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, obviously. You know, people write 1,000-page books. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged has like 70 pages of just ranting from one character in a monologue, and it's fucking bizarre, but, that's the whole thing. I do think that we live in an age where things are artificially inflated to a very great degree. Um, you know, series are sort of made. Thankfully, it's less prominent now, but thanks to the rise of streaming, like we're not forced to have like 13 episode seasons of a TV show. Um, you can have 6 episodes or 8 episodes or whatever works for the show. There is still a lot of padding though. And I think like something like The Irishman did not need to be as long as it did. Um, but yeah, I think it's just that idea that like we live in a culture where everything sort of needs to be bigger, everything needs to be longer, and that's what makes it good.
Do you mind if I ask what you thought should have been cut from The Irishman? Because I had no problem with it.
I don't know if anything necessarily should have been cut, but I don't know, something about The Irishman just didn't sit well with me. I don't know.
Well, that's a real shame. I mean, I nothing's for everybody, I guess. Like I
Yeah.
think that was a pretty pretty good editing job of making it feel propulsive all the way through. But yeah, I mean, this is, I think, key to our discussion last week, which is like editing, as Mike said, the pacing of the story is so much more important than length. Like people read the book series as you were saying with series. Oh, well, I think you meant TV shows, but I was thinking like Brandon Sanderson writing a 10-book series where each book is thousands of pages. As long as it's paced in an exciting manner, you're reading, this much book. That's a lot of book. But you don't look at that and go, what a drag, that's so much book. No, you're like, well, it's broken into individual stories that have chapters, and it's written by a guy who clearly understands what people want. Therefore, it's incredibly popular. And so it's funny, isn't it, that we don't immediately assume that of games? Because if Dying Light 2 said 500 hours long, and we were convinced of the editorial quality of video game entertainment, we'd all have gone, oh my goodness, this is so exciting. But instead we looked at it politically. We were like, oh, this is frustrating. This is just a commercial ploy to talk about games being long for value. And it's like, well, what's the value in that length if it doesn't have a well-paced narrative? And, I don't even mean it has to have a story, because there's the whole other aspect of playing a game just for fun. Like, that still involves good pacing. Halo, even if you skip the cutscenes and ignore what people are saying, it is integral that it is paced properly between your various shooting encounters. People can play those games over and over and over for probably more than 500 hours because they like the way that they're paced.
And Mike, considering you missed that whole conversation last time, did you want to jump in with like really quickly your thoughts on whether it's pacing in games, long games, how that connects to long movies, long books?
It's different for games for so many reasons, but I think the first thing I thought of when that whole Dying Light controversy came up was The Witcher 3. Because it's a game that I've tried so many times to get through, that I love the characters, I love the stories, but I can't get through it because of at least for me personally, the way I play open world games, The Witcher 3 is just so dense, with things to do and side quests and activities and things to collect, that I feel like I at least with my brain, I can't just enjoy the story. I feel like I'm missing out on key parts of lore and things like that. So it feels like that experience isn't for me. And I was worried when I saw the 500 hours thing that maybe Dying Light 2 wouldn't be for me for the same reasons, because they were really catering to that audience that has stuck around with the original Dying Light for years and years and years. Now, obviously, they've explained the whole 500 hours thing, but I just think it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to get mad at Dying Light for having 500 hours of game, regardless of what that 500 hours is spent on, because it is very similar to, like, I'm trying to think of the way I want to phrase this. So the game like The Last of Us is obviously front to back, it is almost entirely straight through, with the exception of maybe you go off the beaten path for a little bit of environmental storytelling, that kind of thing. Whereas Dying Light, the entire experience is built around an open world where you can do so many things. So achieving solid pacing in something like that is a pretty monumental task. And I think saying your game has 500 hours of content without much explaining around it is an even more monumental task, an almost impossible task. But I think people still were a bit quick to jump down Techland's throat, and just assume that it means one thing or the other, and it's going to be like The Witcher 3, myself included. it's hard to judge the length of a game, movie, book, anything like that until we actually get it in our hands and see what it's like to play through the story and how distracting side quests and things are. So yeah, it's kind of an open-ended thought, but that's kind of how I feel about it.
And like what you're saying there about games is something that I'm actually running into right now with God of War. I knew it was open world, but I'm surprised by, I guess, how bold its open world is. But I'm planning on talking about that in a couple of weeks' time, so I'll just leave those thoughts there. Yeah, so final thoughts?
Um, I just want to apologize to everyone if I've been quiet or short at any point in this. These headphones are giving me the worst headache, and I came into this with the
Ooh.
headache and forgot to take medicine, so I apologize. I'm dealing right now. Um, but more than that, um, yeah, I don't know. Just because it's fresh on my mind. I'm excited to see the Batman. Personally, I think 3 hours of Matt Reeves content. Again, I generally trust him to make good decisions with runtime, so I'm excited. If anything, I think the 3 hours runtime made me excited because I think he'll do something special with it.
I agree. Um, Sorry to hear that your headphones are hurting.
I'm
Uh,
so sorry.
no, I've had that similar experience, and it's really frustrating. I agree, and I've seen several Matt Reeves movies, so I'm additionally excited that I'm going to get nearly 3 hours more of one of his films. To Damien's point, he's probably feeling the same about Matt Reeves as he is about superheroes. Because if I recall correctly, War for the Planet of the Apes was also in the vein of a superhero movie, a very entertaining, uh, propulsive blockbuster experience that didn't really have anything to say. And
Um,
I'm guessing that the Batman will be one of those. So I'll really enjoy myself and rate it like 3.5 out of 5, and it'll be like another one of those movies that I get on 4K so that I can test out the new TV kind of thing. Rather than a Titanic where people sort of really fall in love with the characters, I imagine.
I never actually watched War for the Planet of the Apes. I watched the first two. Well, first two, like eighth and ninth, or however many there were.
Right.
Um, so I can't really speak to that specifically. One thing I am excited though is Paul Dano. How do you pronounce his name? I don't know. You know the guy I'm talking about.
Yeah, the Riddler.
Is him? Yeah, is him as the Riddler because he is just such a fantastic actor. I love
He's
him
a
so
freak.
much.
He's a perfect freak.
I love him so much. But other than that, final thoughts. Yeah, I think like talking about the length of things is not necessarily inherently valuable, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have every now and again because there are degrees of things where length matters. Because of what you said, it's not about the length, it's about the pacing. Yeah, and as for our other topic, yeah, it's a mess. Nationalism is something that we need to be on our toes about. I think it's different from patriotism. I think that the two don't really connect, but that's a topic for another day. Um, so we'll end it there. Thank you for your time, and thank you for tuning in.